Was Paul McCartney the reason for the dissolution of the Beatles, which has been the subject of controversial debate? It has been suggested that Paul McCartney was the one responsible for the dissolution of the legendary band known as the Beatles. In point of fact, information that is quite ambiguous regarding the sequel has been circulating for a considerable amount of time, for at least 3 years. Then, on April 10, 1970, McCartney responded to an interview that was conducted by a global media outlet. This interview was taken by the media as an official announcement that the Beatles had disbanded. In point of fact, there are rumors that McCartney is the brains behind the dissolution of the band that was based in London, England. Interview that was misunderstood. During the interview that McCartney conducted on April 10, 1970, the topic of discussion was really his first solo record. Despite this, stories in the media indicated that McCartney had left the band, which ultimately led to the dissolution of the Beatles. In response to the outcry, John Lennon issued a statement that was published in the issue of Rolling Stone that was published on May 14, 1970. McCartney was criticized by him, and he stated that he had produced mayhem. Throughout their time with the Beatles, John Lennon and Paul McCartney were two of the most influential people due to their roles as vocalists and songwriters. On the other hand, disagreements among band members had been going on for a considerable amount of time prior to the interview concerning Paul McCartney's solo record. Conflict inside the organization. After several years of touring, John Lennon, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr were able to persuade Paul McCartney that the band should cease their live performances in the year 1966. The death of Brian Epstein, the Beatles' manager, in August of 1967 marked the beginning of the band's most severe rift. At his townhouse in London, he passed away as a result of an overdose caused by drugs. In order to take over their management, McCartney proposed that his father-in-law's company take over. Instead, John Lennon, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr signed a management contract with Alan Klein, a well-known accountant in the music business, for a period of 3 years. Yoko Ono was another artist with whom Lennon worked more frequently. Harrison's musical career developed as a result of Ringo's decision to begin creating his own tunes. Continued efforts were made by the Beatles to establish their new record labels. Individual members of the Beatles, on the other hand, saw the other members of the band as his backing musicians. Geoff Emerick, a music producer, even quit his job and stopped working with the Beatles because of their disruptive and nefarious behavior. The final member to depart was Paul McCartney. Radio broadcasters cited. In August of 1968, as Starr was working on the White Album, he disappeared from Abbey Road for a period of 2 weeks. His perception was that the other members of the band were more content, and he regarded Starr as an outsider. Nevertheless, he returned and completed the album in its entirety. As a further point of interest, guitarist George Harrison became the second individual to announce their departure. During this time, his ideas for writing songs were disregarded by McCartney and Lennon, which led to this situation. The argument took place during Harrison's lunch break on January 10, 1969, and he announced that he was leaving the Beatles later that day. There are rumors circulating that Eric Clapton will take over for Harrison in the band. The Beatles, however, continued to extend an invitation to Harrison to attend the summit. After they decided against the notion of holding a live concert and instead started working on an album, it was decided that Harrison would come back. At a meeting that took place on September 9, 1969, Lennon, McCartney, and Harrison discussed the future intentions of the Beatles. In order for Starr, who was not there for the meeting, to be able to follow the conversation, the meeting was recorded. On the other hand, during the same week, Lennon and Ono traveled to Canada in order to engage in the Toronto Rock and Roll Festival and to introduce their most recent solo work. In the end, Lennon made the decision to leave the Beatles for good. Even more impressively, John Lennon signed a new contract with the EMI label during a business conference that took place on September 20, 1969. Despite the fact that McCartney was not the first member of the Beatles to quit, he was the first to announce that the band had disbanded. Because of significant disagreements, Lennon, Harrison, and Starr left the band. After that, on April 17, 1970, the album that McCartney had been working on was ultimately published, despite the fact that the disbandment had not been officially declared during that time. In August of 1970, Paul McCartney began action to establish a partnership with the Beatles, saying that his artistic and financial freedom had been infringed on multiple occasions. This is due to the fact that the contract that the Beatles had with Alan Klein said that Apple would get all of the cash that was produced from each member's solo work. On the 31st of December in 1970, Paul McCartney filed a lawsuit against John Lennon, George Harrison, Ringo Starr, and Apple Corps in London's High Court, challenging their decision to disband the Beatles. His claim was successful in court. As of the 29th of December in 1974, McCartney officially parted ways with the Beatles. In the meantime, the positions held by the remaining 3 members of the band are also individuals who are considered to be musicians.